You're listening to the Hayek Program podcast. This podcast includes audio from lectures, interviews, and discussions from scholars and visitors of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. To learn more about the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. To learn about graduate student fellowship opportunities with the Mercatus Center at George Mason University for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org.
The conversation was kind of amazing because, you have Jack, who really is into microeconomics.
And let me jump in here for a second with Jack. I don't think he gets enough recognition in the history of the center and all of that, but like his micro one course, you said Henderson and Quandt, Golden, Ferguson, it was very methodical. And there's one thing that I remember clearly that I took from it, and we have in our Hayne Economic Way of Thinking textbook. And I remember it turned a light on. We're talking about supply and demand and all that, and Jack turned to the class and said, understand, quantity demanded and quantity supplied, they're plans. We're not talking just about P's and Q's here, right, and solving algebraic problems.
Right.
These are plans, and we're talking about the reconciliation of plans, the coordination of plans as quantity supplied and quantity demanded move closer to one another. And even as an undergraduate at Northern Michigan University, no one ever said it so clearly and so simply.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of students undergraduates certainly, and I emphasize this in my 101 class, and we do in the textbook, I think students can appreciate more of how markets coordinate when it's not just talking about simple P's and Q's, but the convergence of plans.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Right. And if there is one thing, and it's such a simple idea that I took from Jack's Micro One course, it was that. And another person we should mention, Colleen.
Oh yeah,
Colleen Moretta.
Yeah, she was the glue that held them all together.
It's this whole egalitarian place and all of that. And Colleen held the center together.
Yeah.
She's dealing with young assistant professors who are busy teaching, who are busy doing research and trying to get published. She's dealing with all these crazy young students. And she was the glue and the sensibility that held that center together for years.
Yeah, Colleen was amazing. And, these guys were all assistant professors trying to not only do all that stuff, but try to do it at a level to earn tenure in a department that just gave a Nobel Prize to somebody.
Right.
And had another guy who eventually is going to be distinguished fellow of the AEA. And you have you and I in particular took advantage of this. We have Kenneth Bolden come into the mix, and so all of a sudden we have the second John Bates Clark Medal winner.
Yeah.
The other thing that I think the center did, which was pretty amazing, besides the idea of making it seem like all of this stuff was freely available to us at any time we wanted on demand, right? We never had to wait to, after Gary Becker passed away, there was a discussion about how Gary Becker managed his time. Now, obviously, Gary Becker is, a superstar in economics, and his secretary managed his time so that a student could meet with him, a dissertation student could meet with him, and they'd have 15 minutes, and that was it, and then they'd have to go on. So like that. We never had any of that. They
Not
had
at all.
Open door policy for us or whatever. So it was kind of crazy.
And Don, like Don would go to lunch with us.
And dinner. Remember, because he had to teach at night.
Yeah, that's right.
And
dinner. Yeah, I'm right. It wasn't. There were a couple occasional lunches, but it was dinner. And you're right. Don's. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that a part of that is weird in the sense that we were going to school, basically Monday through Thursday, 7:30 to 10 o'clock at night, because they didn't have the only person who had a afternoon class was Buchanan. Everyone else had the nighttime classes. And at the same time, our seminars were on Friday, and we didn't have the internet. So when we were working, we were at the office on Saturdays as well. So basically, we were in Robinson Hall 6 days a week for some variation of it of that day. And they were too, right? Because they couldn't work at home in the way that you could work at home today. And so it was different. And I think that Jack and Don in particular were so giving of their time. And when you were talking about Jack and micro, I do think his book that came out of his dissertation is underappreciated for exactly the reasons you're talking about.
I agree.
It should have been discussed more. And in a weird way, Don.
Part of the problem, Pete. Part of the problem was the publisher, Philosophy.
Yeah, it was ridiculous. Yeah. And it was ridiculously expensive and hard to get and everything. But if you think about it, even Don in the Rivalry book, which is his most articulated statement about the difference between the neoclassical and the Austrian view, he kind of glosses over some details in that differences, which Jack delves into in much greater detail. So even issues like information search costs, people could read Lavoie's book and think, maybe not national economic planning, but Rivalry, they might be able to think that it's really like a really complicated search problem. I mean, that would have to be a bad reading of it, but you could get that. But you can if you read national economic planning. But Jack, you would never make that error.
Yeah.
You understand what's all involved in search theory.
Well, Don's Rivalry book is, of course, his most Kersnerian.
Yeah.
Now, Kersner's good on search costs and all that. but I think part of it was he wrote it under Israel, but part of it was his audience, Don's audience. And he had to, I think, step very carefully as to not alienate the audience, but to draw them in and understand the argument he was ultimately trying to make. But I also agree with you that Jack's book goes into choice theory in a way that really no Austrians of that time, certainly of that time, and really even after, Austrians haven't explored choice theory the way that Jack did.
There's a young guy, Marek Hudek, in the Czech Republic who's trying to do some things on this. He's written some good papers, but if you remember, even with Don, like being influenced by Jack when Jack was doing those papers on ordinal marginal utility, and Don just telling us, well, indifference curves are good enough for government work kind of thing, right?
Yes.
And so Jack really was. So I agree with you. That was Jack does get undersold, but I wanted to go back to Don and ask you about your own work in this case, because we've been talking about teaching and economic theory in general, but both of us went into the field of comparative economic systems. And when I'm trying to summarize the position, sometimes I describe us as Don's lieutenants.
He called us that.
I think he called us disciples, which is a deeper word. and I think your response is that I'm not the disciple of anyone, right? So anyway, but we were. I tell people in the shorthand way, we were his lieutenants. And what happened was Rivalry and Central Planning comes out. Both of us are so thrilled that our professor has published these two books, which we think are like the 1-2 punch against comprehensive central planning against non-comprehensive planning, and the Rivalry and Central Planning book gets some notoriety, so big people. So, this guy, I think his name's Bigelow, publishes an essay, in the EJ saying Lavoie's book's great, but he doesn't understand what the hell's going on in Yugoslavia. Bottomore publishes a book, says Lavoie's book's great, but he doesn't understand the Soviet experience. So I take the Soviet experience, you take Yugoslavia, and we go from there. We work on these different parallel but different sides of the debate. So forget mine. I want to ask you about the Yugoslavian model, your experience going up to Cornell and working with the leading workers self-management scholar in the world. You're Slavonic. You also go and work in Yugoslavia with the various different, as a Fulbright fellow.
Yeah.
This is how you begin your career, Cornell and then Yugoslavia, when it still is Yugoslavia, but not,
just barely.
Yeah. So tell us about that experience, what that was like, both for you and Julie, like picking up and going to Yugoslavia. That must have been an amazing trip, it's one thing to go from northern Michigan to Fairfax, but Fairfax to Ithaca to where were you at? Dubrovnik, I guess, right? Or something.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time in Dubrovnik. We went to Zagreb. Look, it was really hard convincing Julie to go from Marquette, Michigan to Fairfax, Virginia. But somehow we were both excited about going to Yugoslavia. So that was great. My research, I wrote my I think you're right that you took there were reasons why we did what we did.
Yeah.
And we were responding, and like you said, lieutenants. I think Don did call us lieutenants too.
Okay.
but Don couldn't do everything.
Right.
He couldn't answer every argument. And so there's the empirical fact of Soviet history, and there's this both empirical and theoretical fact of Yugoslavia, and he couldn't get into all that, and he encouraged us to move in those directions. And I think both of our projects were founded upon and complemented Don's project in those two 1985 books. There's something I should say with Don, and that is, Don says that, and I really liked his metaphor of Marx's view of socialism as being this kind of like negative, this negative template of exploring real existing capitalism through the lens of some general socialist vision, yet condemning capitalism because it fails to achieve what his vision would achieve.
Right.
And Don says in Rivalry and Central Planning, and he said in his lectures and all of that Marx has a fully consistent and coherent view of socialism. Fully consistent and coherent. And socialism is founded upon central planning. You and I have talked about this for decades now, Pete.
Yeah.
It's founded on central planning. So here now I'm finally looking
Just so that people know that we spent many an hour in Fenwick Library in a little cubicle with the door shut discussing the economic and philosophical manuscripts.
Yes. We read Marx. There was no one teaching Marx at George Mason.
And I was trying to insist that the old Marx is the same as the young Marx, and there's only one Marx.
That's right. And I think there is only one Marx. But Don wanted to say that one Marx is a central planner.
Yeah, you wanted to say Praxis Marxism.
Yeah. And so I'm looking at, exposing myself to Yugoslavian Marxism and all of that. And they're talking about a different Marx. They were arguing there's one Marx too.
Yes, I know.
It's the young Marx who matures, but he never gives up the idea of alienation and all that stuff.
Dave, just a side note very quick.
Yeah.
So we first meet 1984, and you're talking to me about some things like this. You might have even brought up the Rothbard disillusionment or whatever. And I said to you something like, but the freedom philosophy, which is what they call it at FEE, right? So I said, but Dave, the freedom philosophy. And I remember, I'll never forget this, you saying, there's many different freedom philosophies, Pete. And I was like, what do you mean? There's only one?
Yeah.
But T.N. Graves told me there's only one.
Right. No one has a monopoly on a freedom philosophy.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, but that relates to what you're just talking about.
Yeah, well, that's just it.
Yeah.
Because they have this.
Yeah,
the Yugoslav Marxists had a freedom philosophy too themselves. So did the Soviets in their own crazy way. But so did those in Yugoslavia. And the thing is, their interpretation of Marx was that there is one coherent Marx. But their argument was, and I'm reading this on my own now, and their argument was that Marx's vision had to be one of decentralized planning, because if he upheld central planning as the ideal, a set of economic structures and institutions, central planning not only gives us a kind of Stalinism, but it gives us, even in theory, one universal capitalist dictating to everyone else what to do, how to do, where to do, etc. And it wouldn't end alienation. There'd be no markets, but now people would be, instead of being at mercy of the man, the capitalist man, people would be at mercy, this is my slogan, they'd be at mercy of the plan.
Yeah.
And so I'm reading this, and it's not jiving exactly with what Don was saying. And so I go to Don's office, and some of our discussions, they were never heated or anything like that, but Don was resisting my idea that maybe Marx, while the young and the mature and all that, it's all one Marx. This stuff of decentralized planning makes a lot more sense within Marx's own vision. Now, it doesn't work. We all understand that, and I attempted to articulate that. But so there's not necessarily a full and coherent Marx himself. And it took a while and several conversations with Don. And I don't know if I ever fully convinced him at the time, but he became open to that argument. And that becomes the central argument of my dissertation. Yeah. And remember, it's titled Marxism and Worker Self-Management, the Essential Tension. And I think there's a tension in Marx himself. The logic of abolishing markets and all of that, Marx understood some of the logic, and the logic leads to centralization. But that rubs against his view of praxis and all this stuff and alienation. And so there's some tension there. And what I tried to show is even in the theory coming out of Yugoslavia, there's tensions in their own theory between decentralization and centralization that they can't solve. And those tensions arise largely through the knowledge problem. Mm-hmm. Plans have to be reconciled. And, we could go into a lot of what all that's about. But I saw Yugoslavia as really problematic. You mentioned going to Cornell. One of the things in Don's...
I just before I'll get to Cornell in 1 second, but I just want to, I think this issue of plan, it goes back to what you're saying with Jack. So, but that notion of the reconciliation process of plans, or reconciliation of conflicting plans as what happens in markets and politics and everything, that actually permeated our work, our joint work together on how we understood market process. It was all about this reconciliation process. It's why we didn't think that the Walrasian model that we were learning from Mike could do it, because it all required pre-reconciliation.
Yes.
And it didn't focus on the reconciliation process.
Yes.
And so I want you to talk about your experience with Vanek and your book and everything that you did with him. But there's two things that I want to come back to about this work before we go on to other things, which is one, democratic theory and the implications that you see for radical decentralization with regard to democratic theory. Yeah. Right. So like in your second book on these issues, and then also the role that you see of worker self-management in a market society as opposed to in juxtaposition to a market society.
Yeah. I'll focus mostly on the latter. In Don's comparative systems course, he covers worker self-management in the context of Yugoslavia. So, the self-managed firm, and there's great debates on that, but it was the neoclassical economics of the self-managed firm, from Vanek to Pejovic, was all looking at the firm structure as idealized in Yugoslavia. And in that course, Don dealt with that. And he also seemed to, in a way, very subtly, make Vanek out to be some kind of fascist.
Yes.
In some sense.
Luigi Valori.
Yeah, Luigi, yeah, right. Which we did study actual fascists in And
this was the modern version of it.
Right. In some sense, it harkens back to a kind of fascism. So now I'm reading Vanek on my own, like as a third-year student or whatever it was, and I don't see a fascist in him. I see a huge advocate of worker self-management, and I thought, well, I'm criticizing this. I'm exploring it critically in my dissertation, and I wrote Vanek a letter early on and said, what's the possibility of visiting for a semester and getting to know, you and your approach to the theory and all of that. And it was too early on. And he wrote me a kind short letter saying, well, maybe when you're further along in your degree program, you write back to me again, which I then did. And the interesting thing, Pete, the center paid for that semester.
Yeah, they were amazing.
I didn't receive money from Cornell. The center paid for it, and it was the last semester when I was working on my dissertation, and so I sat in on Vanek's course on worker self-management, and we had many conversations, and I found, well, this has really nothing to do with fascism. And I found that Vanek was, unfortunately, he looked at the self-managed firm, Pete, as a panacea. Whether it's self-management in a decentralized system like Yugoslavia was supposed to be or aspiring to be, or whether it's self-managed firms in this country or that, Vanek thought that worker self-management in any institutional structure was going to solve problems of worker rights. It's going to solve problems associated with environmental concerns. It'll probably solve problems of racism and sexism.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, he saw it solving everything. Yeah.
Right. No matter where it's adopted in the world, he was gung-ho for worker self-management because he literally did see it as a panacea. And I did get that sense being there that semester with him. And I tried to convince him in casual conversation, delightful conversation, that the only way self-management makes sense is in truly in a market process.
But you actually edited like a major reference volume with him.
We edited. Pete, I was in upstate New York. I was teaching at SUNY Oswego, and there was an evening where I was throwing darts at a dartboard, and I was thinking about paper or book ideas. And in the one setting, within 1 hour, 3 edited book projects popped into my head. The first, the market process.
Yeah.
I thought, Pete and we can't let the market process journal articles just sit on shelves. We got to put this together as a book. So that was one, and it was accomplished. The second thing, throwing darts, was a book on market process theories, edited books, which you and I then did.
Yeah.
And the third was a book collecting all the classic literature, the debates on worker-managed firms, worker self-management, self-managed socialism. And that I couldn't do on my own because I really didn't have a reputation at all in this area. And I approached Vanek about that and Vanek had many students out there who were well along in their careers or tenured, and none of them saw the entrepreneurial opportunity for that set of books. So I approached Yaroslav on that. This is after I got back.
What a small world this is all about is that I went to Oakland University. You go to Cornell and then to Yugoslavia.
Yeah.
At Oakland University, they had it was a research active department and mainly health economists. And one of the main health economists that was there was a guy who did his PhD with Vanek.
Oh, really?
And they had a program where you had a senior mentor that would try to tell you. So would try to tell you how to be an economist and get tenure and all that kind of stuff like that as you go through. And he was my mentor. Yeah, it was pretty amazing. And so that was kind of a funky thing. I also think this issue about being entrepreneurial is sometimes underappreciated by graduate students. And in retrospect, I think about like weird things a lot like that. So you and I took every advantage to learn from Kenneth Boulding as much as we could. Not all of our fellow classmates did that. And Kenneth Boulding ended up by passing away when we were very young. And we got invited by his former students to write for a volume honoring him as part of his obituary. And how the hell did they know about us? And I can't figure out how the hell they knew about us, except that Boulding must have said something. And I think that the reason why Boulding might have said something is because we were persistent.
Yeah. Well, listen, first thing, 1985 was a great year at the center because that's where we really had our feet on the ground, right? Yeah. We're establishing ourselves as students. Steve shows up in 85, and Don's 2 books come out. And Larry White's book comes out, Free Banking in Britain. And so it was, it was a real splash that year. And then the next year was even better. 1986, look at, you and I had Buchanan's Constitutional Economics course. And we had Boulding's History of Thought course. Yeah. Now here, I felt that semester that there was this line back to Frank Knight.
Yeah.
Right? In one form or another. And there's this whole Knightian blood running through these 2 professors in that course. And it was just an absolutely fascinating time. And let me just mention one other professor who I really enjoyed there. The same year, the spring semester of 86, I took Thelma Levine's course. And it was offered through it was a graduate course offered through the sociology department. And Thelma was a Robinson professor, chaired professor, which she remained then the rest of her career for I don't know how many years. And Ralph Rector and I took that course, and there was maybe only a dozen students in it. And it was originally intended to be a course on the sociology of knowledge. But Ralph and I had all this interest in the philosophy of science, hermeneutics, and all of that. And we were the only ones talking in her class. And she was a great teacher. She was fantastic. And she might have been the best teacher that I had in my whole career as a student. But the thing is, based on our...
Look at her PBS series.
Yes, and she
makes Socrates to Sartre.
From Socrates to Sartre. She had it was kind of like the free to choose of philosophy.
Yep.
And she saw our burning interest in the philosophy of science that she basically converted what was supposed to be a sociology of knowledge course into a philosophy of science course. And that was fantastic. So this is 1986. So I had 3 fantastic professors at the same time. Boulding, let's not forget, Boulding was the one who said, he said that George Mason University was so great because, quote, it has no tradition and everything is up for grabs.
Yeah.
And that was spot on.
Yeah.
And that was also part of that egalitarian aspect that you were saying. Even grad students' voices mattered to the professors.
Yeah, we had.
It was amazing.
Just to one of the things I often think about is as graduate students, what did Don and Jack and others around the area expose us to, right? So McCloskey came several times, right? And McCloskey had the JEL paper on the rhetoric of economics, and so we were like, a revolution's about to happen in economics, right? Klammer, was there. Kolander came. You would have philosophers like Sokolowski, then because of that, we ended up by going and seeing Gadamer live. We actually saw Hans Georg Gadamer give a talk. If you remember, it was on the spoken word.
Yes.
Amazing. And the guy was older than dirt, and he gave this amazing talk. It was like, amazing. But also at the university at the time, Chomsky came through.
Yes.
Talked about the Vietnam War. We were there, Abby Hoffman.
And Nicaragua.
And that's exactly right. And Abby Hoffman was there.
Yeah.
And by the way, the Abby Hoffman was a big audience, but Chomsky spoke in front of a very small audience.
Yes, I remember that.
And so we were like right up there with him. And if you remember in '86, after Buchanan won a Nobel Prize, I remember a conversation we had with him after he gave the IHS talk, and you and I were defending the 60s against him because he was complaining about it. But he actually would argue with us about it rather than just dismiss these kids as idiots. And now reading him in retrospect, that was such a big issue for him. He hated the 60s.
Yeah, I didn't realize how much of how close of an issue that was to his heart.
Yeah,
and we're like, just waving our hands.
We're like, the anti-war movement's great. Here's this guy who's, Admiral Nimitz's, second in command out there in the Pacific, and we're like, what are you talking about? War is horrible. Gene Sharp. We don't need to do this. And he's entertaining it because, this is also bolding. It's just I'm getting away from substance and just putting it in this framework, but I think there was such a unique environment for debating ideas and being listened to by people, encouraged. I mean, Victor Vanberg, I mentioned Mike Alexiev asking me to give lectures in his class. This is to PhD students, not like presenting my paper. Actually, like you substitute this week for me, and we talked about this. But I had that happen to me with, with Vanberg, did that, and Rowley even. Charles Rowley, who was the most conventional professor in all of mankind, asked me to give a presentation about Austrian subjectivism and industrial organization and all this stuff and costs and everything. And so it was kind of, it was an unusual environment. And you'll remember this. It was very unusual because going back to what you first said, it was an environment where people also showed up that weren't in school, but were from the area, the DC area, and they would bring in their copies of Man, Economy, and State, or things like Prices in Production, which were read like 5 million times, and someone would say something, and they'd like flip to a page,
right?
And and this is the professor, like someone like Kevin Greer teaching modern macroeconomics, and like Hayek on page whatever, and even I would be like, that's a little weird,
right?
You shouldn't be doing that, but. Anyway, I wanted to, again, you go and you teach you finish your fellowship in Yugoslavia. Tell us a little bit about the experience you had in Yugoslavia in terms of the conditions of the world at the time.
Yeah.
1989.
Yeah, it was right on the edge of the whole collapse. And Julie and I got there in January of '89. I had defended my dissertation in December. We got in December of '88.
Yeah. And
so and I was just got that done, and all of a sudden we find ourselves in Zagreb at the University of Zagreb, and the first transaction I made was in the underground market. The very first transaction, we had the rector of the University of Zagreb, Duško Sekulić. He got a free apartment as the rector, and it was a new apartment. And we had negotiated beforehand $150 a month, and we were there for 6 months, so $900 cash. And we arrived. There were many transportation problems getting there. We arrive at about 1 o'clock in the morning. There's a frozen fog in the air. We step off a bus. We're in Croatia now, and there's a man standing there under like a light, in the fog, and it was him. He had waited for hours for us to show up, actually, and he took us to the apartment. And the first thing I did was take out a stack of cash and give it to him. And he was a nice guy and all of that, but I got to tell you, Julie and I felt, and we're almost certain of it, after about 4 weeks in that apartment, that it was bugged.
Yeah.
And that was interesting. That's an interesting experience, Pete.
Yeah.
There are too many coincidences about things that we'd say in the apartment that would then be in a way responded to when we're dealing with others. And, you know, I don't need any good reason to be paranoid, but I had a good reason with that. So we learned how to, you know, if we're going to say anything, you know, that's important and shouldn't be shared or heard by others, we'd have to, you know, talk outside, speak outside together. But
have you ever read the Figgis book, Whisperers?
No.
If you get a chance, it's a really great book. It's about this phenomena in the Soviet context.
Yeah.
This idea of whispering and everything.
Yeah. It's an unsettling feeling, I'll tell you that. When we got there, January of '89, the inflation rate was a mere 200%. I got paid through my Fulbright grant. I got paid the dinar equivalent of $500 a month. And I can't remember what it was. 100,000 dinars equaled $1. So my first paycheck, they paid me in dinars, was whatever, I can't remember, you know, what it was, hundreds of thousands or 5 million dinars I'm getting. The Fulbright people wanted us, Americans, to use their banking system, play by the rules of the game. And the banking system with 200% inflation, and the interest rate was only like 30% at the time, the nominal interest rate, and there's a 200% rate of inflation. What we did with each paycheck once a month, I would go and withdraw that full amount of dinars. So after a few months, we literally had bricks of paper money in our hands. And that's a little tricky, Pete, because the teller would be handing over these bricks of money, and we're putting them in our pockets or backpack or whatever. And there's people struggling like hell, right, in the country. And they're looking at us, and I spoke a terrible Croatian. Right. And they knew we weren't, you know, citizens there. And it was a little uncomfortable walking home with that much cash on us each time. And
when I was in Moscow, Dave, I decided I was going to live in the ruble economy and not dollarize myself. That was my goal, right? And because I wanted to see what it was really like. But I carried around the cash that I had in my boots, in socks against my insoles, right? That's where I had it. So Dolan and his wife are there because he's teaching in Moscow, Kitty, and Dolan and his wife, and they're party people, right? They like to drink, and he invites me out, and I'm not, you know, I was a frat boy, so I know how to drink, but I don't know how to drink like Ed Dolan and his wife do, because they're professional at it. And so it's like almost midnight, and I'm in the middle of Moscow, and I got to get out to my hotel. And Dolan arranges, you know, comes out with me, and they wait till I get a cab. So I get a cab, and Dolan corrects my bad Russian to make sure the guy knows where he's taking me. And I'm pretty looped, okay? But I'm sitting there in the back, and then all of a sudden it dawned on me that if this guy turned around and took me to like the river and just smacked me in the head and took my boots off, he would have enough money for the rest of his, because I was living in Prague at the time and going back. So I had all this money that I was carrying around with me rather than in a bank. And so all of a sudden I was like sober as like a judge, you know. I was like, oh my God, like, you know, Pete, wake up, you know, don't ever have anything. And I'm like, you know, I couldn't wait to get the hell out of that cab. And it is scary as hell, you know, when you realize these kind of issues and you don't know the interaction. So you're over there and you're dealing with all of this. The economy's collapsing and everything, but then the bombs start, or the bombers, right?
Yeah.
What was that like?
Well,
Civil
what do you
War
mean?
starts to break out.
Well, no. It was well, yes and no. But before I get to that, people were coming to us as we got settled down in the area, asking for dollars, and we're saying, we're stuck with this crap too, these dinars. So I'd occasionally be able to find a way to convert some of those dinars into dollars, but instead, what we did was spend, Pete. Just spend. And the exchange rate was so favorable to the dollar that we could go out to eat every night. No problem spending my travel, and spend it as quick as you can. And by the way, and see, this is what's nice what I could share with my undergraduate students in the classroom. We go to a grocery store for shopping, and there would be women, say in a small grocery store, and you go on different days of the week, and these women would simply go around from item to item, changing prices daily.
Yeah.
Now, like I said, the inflation rate was 200% when we got there. By the end of 1989, it was 2,000%.
Yeah.
And while we were able to live comfortably with some under surveillance, but to see people's everyday lives.
Yeah, it's horrible.
Yeah. And I tell you this, being in a self-managed firm didn't solve their problem at all. I could tell you that. But there are also problems in Kosovo. And we could see clearly real nationalistic animosities between Croatia, Serbia, and the ethnic Albanians in Kosovo, and the Serbs' treatment of them. It was scary. Yeah. I almost went. There was a couple who were from America on a Fulbright. The woman was on a Fulbright grant, and her husband, and we almost convinced me and the husband and I. We almost convinced, and he was legally blind. We almost convinced ourselves and our wives that the two of us were going to travel down to Kosovo and check things out.
Yeah.
And in the end, we didn't.
Thank God.
But that was a very scary time, because you could see there's the macroeconomic problem. There's the microeconomic problem of the nonsensical nature of worker self-management and decentralized socialism. That in itself wasn't working. And there were these nationalistic animosities. And so we got back to the U.S. in late July of 1989. And it was shortly after that the bombing, and the outright war began. Several months after that.
I was just going to say that, one of the things that Emily Chamley Wright, when I was talking to her, stressed was about how Don really challenged his students with the height of civilization that represented Germany at the turn of the century and in the beginning of the 20th century, and then how Germany descended into barbarism. I think Yugoslavia is one of the has parts of Yugoslavia are some of the most beautiful places in the world, just physically, absolutely amazingly beautiful. And the people are very friendly and, outgoing and everything like that. And it devolved into a civil war of, if you remember, even when we were kids and they had the Olympics, right? We were in graduate school and they had the Olympics, and the Italian downhill skier Tomba was running.
Oh, yeah.
And had the Yugoslavian guy with the coat with all the fur. He would shake with the thing.
Yeah, right.
I went out. I was been in Serbia and gone out and people just break out into song and all these things like that. And so it's a totally different kind of feel to then see a country end up in such civil war with each other, and what that teaches us about political, legal, social arrangements, I think is something that the current generation see they have different tensions that they see, but we saw those tensions.
Yeah, and it's in a way it's amazing that Yugoslavia was stitched together the way it was and lasted that long. Because the animosities go back
Yeah, a century.
Yeah. They go back a long time. I think you mentioned Dubrovnik. I spent 6 weeks there, 3 different sessions, 2-week sessions at the Inter-University Center for Postgraduate Studies. And that was the highlight of my time in Yugoslavia. Dubrovnik itself is a great, old Venetian town on the Dalmatian coast and all that. But it was there that at one conference for 2 weeks, I was able to meet the Praxis group philosophers. I met Mihailo Markovic, Zagorka Golubovic, Svetozar Stojanovic, Rudy Supek. Yeah. And these were guys that I've read, and Zagorka was a woman, but these are people I read at George Mason.
Right.
And now I'm able to be with them and have sustained conversations with them about their view of Marx, about their view, their what they saw as the potential and the problems in Yugoslavia. And also, you could see, but we couldn't talk about it, their nationalism, because these were academics from both Belgrade and Zagreb, Serbia and Croatia. And it was a really tense time down there. Yeah. And they really didn't want to talk about the national problem.
Right.
And they were in the midst of some of them developing and flaming the national problem. Look at Markovic, perhaps the most well-known of the Praxis group. When Milosevic comes to power in Serbia, Markovic became his top propagandist.
Yeah, unbelievable.
Now here you got a guy who's been a Marxist all of his life, speaking of internationalism, right? And all of that. And Milosevic comes to power in Belgrade, and all of a sudden Markovic, it's like he forgot. And now he's wrong as a Marxist to begin with.
But he has stronger internationalist beliefs than to come to that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I found that fascinating. By the way, another seminar in Dubrovnik was on anarchism. And it brought scholars of anarchism from across Europe to Dubrovnik. And we sat for 2 weeks. People presented papers. There were discussions. There were debates on anarchism in all of its forms. It also brought some real anarchist young people from Denmark and that. And that was a fascinating experience, being with scholars and being with true blue anarchists for 2 weeks. And the thing is, we all figured that must have been the first above ground conference on anarchism in Eastern Europe in 40 years.
Thank you for listening to the Hayek Program podcast. To learn more about the research, scholars, and work of the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. For more information about graduate student fellowship opportunities for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org. We hope you recommend students to our programs or consider applying yourself.